Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and I thank you for joining us for our journey of faith in the light of the cross, in which we continue our journey with overviews, and this is our second overview. We look up on our screen and we see the theme for this second overview. The D&P editors were both sons of Levi. The priest faded with the temple's ruins, but some Levites inspired the apostles to believe it was God's will to spread the gospel as universal aliens, and I hope you come to understand this term. We go on to our next screen and we read, Levites from outside of Judah inspired the church in the first century to grow in Acts. Read segments 154 and 155. Now, St. Stephen belonged to a Greek-speaking Levitical synagogue in Jerusalem. He freed Paul and the apostles from Hebrew to preach the gospel in Greek or any other language. The Levites had lived as aliens across the ancient world and identified with Deuteronomy 26:5, their book. My father was a wandering Aramean who went down to Egypt and lived there as an alien. We go on to our next screen. Stephen made believers comfortable leaving Judaism and spreading the gospel as aliens. Now we go back to the destruction of the 10 northern tribes in 722. As the Assyrians conquered Israel, the northern kingdom, the priests and Levites of Israel's tribes migrated south to Jerusalem with the core of Deuteronomy. They were carrying it with them. But Jerusalem's temple needed no priest in 720, nor Levites. So they made Israel's priests prove they were seed and blood of Zadok, David's priest. Few could prove it. So most were considered Levites. They were reduced to Levites who lived as aliens in poverty outside the walls of Jerusalem in Judah. We go on to our next screen and we read, the Levites had always felt like aliens, but their skills gave them considerable influence. The second law, which is the translation of Deuteronomy, was put together to reform Israel's evil holy places before they were destroyed, so God would save it from Assyria, but it didn't happen. King Hezekiah of Judah admired the second law when they brought it down to him, and he used it to reform Judah to save it from an Assyrian invasion. Even more, Isaiah, a Levite prophet, helped to wondrously save Jerusalem in 701. Isaiah told Hezekiah to have faith, and God put a plague on the Assyrians, and they withdrew. So the alien northern Levites began to win influence in Judah. We go on to the next screen, and we read, being aliens made the Levites work harder to achieve as skilled urban city workers, for they were not permitted to own land. That's what inheritance meant, owning land. King Hezekiah died in 686, and Manasseh, his son, ruled Judah as a pagan king to 642. He was labeled the worst king in Israel's history. He left Judah in deep need of reform, for the fertility cults totally corrupted the temple. When Josiah became king, the Levites from the north were ready for another attempt to reform. We go on to our next screen and we read, in 526, this is again 20 years later, Jeremiah started preaching reform. 4 years later, in 522, King Josiah ordered the temple to be renovated, for it had fallen into disrepair. Soon Hilkiah the priest said, I have found the book of the law, Deuteronomy, in the Lord's house. This is in 2 Kings 22:8. Jeremiah's father was a priest named Hilkiah from Anatoth, 3 miles north of Jerusalem, who had again been editing second law for another attempt at reform in Judah. So the two great prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah from the north, and their Levites. We go on to our next screen and we read, This Reform edition accepted the Jerusalem priestly tradition of one place for sacrifice. We read in Deuteronomy 12:14, make your offering only at the one place the Lord designates, that is Jerusalem. So Moses supposedly said it 1,000 years before. Now the Levites also accepted low social status as God's will. They were never to own land. 12:29, when you tithe, remember the Levite, the resident alien, the orphan, and the widow. They were placed with this group because they were very poor. Now the second law, Deuteronomy, repeats the equivalent 4 other times. So as you read Deuteronomy, they keep emphasizing, be kind to the Levites, the orphan, the widows, and the resident aliens. But Jeremiah's preaching and second law could not inspire Judeans to circumcise their heart. Remember, Jeremiah kept saying that. You have to circumcise your heart and mean it. We go on to our next screen and we read, so the reform failed and poor good King Josiah was killed fighting Egypt in 609. Josiah's son Jehoiakim ignored the reform to please Egypt. You do what the Egyptians want you to do. Now you realize that Judah was in a pincer movement between the great kingdoms of the north and Egypt to the south. And that's what they were trying to survive between. When Babylon defeated Egypt in 606, Jehoiakim accepted Babylon's rule. But then he refused to pay the annual tribute in 599. Jehoiakim soon surrendered, and the top 10% was decently taken to Babylon in 598. They were respected somewhat. Many skilled Levites were in the top 10%. We go on to our next screen, and we read, when the D&P editors gathered in Babylon, they searched the scriptures handed down to them so they could agree on God's will for Judah. What was the future? They focused on Jacob's will and his disinherited sons. This is important. Now, Genesis 34, we go back a few chapters. Shechem, a Hivite prince, raped Jacob's daughter Dinah, for he wished to marry her. So his father Hamor arranged a marriage with Jacob. But Dinah's brothers demanded all the Hivites to be circumcised before the wedding. We go on to the next screen and we read, when the Hivites were in most pain, Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levite, slew them in fury with Levites' circumcision knives. They were nasty. So then in Genesis 49, we get back to Jacob's will. Jacob gives his last will and testament. Reuben, his firstborn, was disinherited for having sex with one of Jacob's wives. Secondly, then he disinherited Simeon and Levite for killing the men of the Hivites in their furious wrath. What's the conclusion? This meant that the fourth son, Judah, was next in line to receive Jacob's inheritance, and the Levites from the north had to agree. We go on to the next screen and we read, this left Joseph's inheritance. Now the Levites from the north, we said, really respected Joseph. Jacob's favored firstborn and favored by all the Levites. Joseph's sons through Ephraim, his two sons, were kings over Israel after the split at Solomon's death in 922. But the 3 altars of Shechem, Shiloh, and Bethel were very corrupted by the fertility cults, and all in the tribal land of Ephraim, later called Samaria. So it's just blotched out, but it's just north of Jerusalem. All agreed that the 3 altars in the north must be suppressed, and the one place for sacrifice was Jerusalem, and Judah was God's will. Thus Joseph's tribes were suppressed. That's the whole northern kingdom, actually. We go on to the next screen and we read, they asked what else said that God willed that Jacob, Israel's inheritance, rested on Judah. They read Genesis 48. Before Jacob gave his last will, Joseph took his 2 sons to Jacob. Jacob said, Ephraim and Manasseh are mine, though born in Egypt, just as my number 1 son Reuben and my 2 sons Simeon are mine. Now we go to 14. Israel put his right hand on Ephraim and his left on Manasseh. So Joseph tried to switch his hands because the right hand is the main blessing. But Israel, Jacob, insisted and said, the secondborn will be greater than the firstborn. Now I want you to notice that the Bible stopped using the word Jacob and started referring to him as Israel. This is important later on. We continue on to our next screen. Thus Ephraim ruled over the northern tribes. Then Jacob blessed Joseph with vague words. In chapter 49:26, the blessing of Joseph, who was set apart from his brothers, are strong. That's all Jacob says in his last will and testament. The Levites served the kings of North or Judah equally, so they could agree that Ephraim had squandered the blessings of Joseph and that Judah was the intended inheritance of God. Thus Jacob's true inheritance rested on David, Judah, and the temple in Jerusalem. We go on to the next screen and we read, Levitical inheritance came during the Exodus. Exodus 28. Moses, also a Levite, appointed his brother Aaron the first priest in the wilderness. When Aaron let the people run wild before the golden calf while he was on Sinai, Moses called his fellow Levites to kill the offenders, which they did with their circumcision knives. Moses blessed the Levites by assigning them to carry the Ark of the Covenant and to assist Aaron and his sons as priests and to help enforce God's law. This is around 1250. We go on to our next screen. So Levites became carpenters, tent makers, tailors, jewelers, vessel makers, but most important, many learned to read and write. For Moses wanted educated teachers of the law to enforce it as God's lawyers and judges. They also enforced pure food laws and learned remedies to heal the sick. So you have the beginning of the medical profession. The exiled Levites accepted Moses' will as God's eternal will and their eternal inheritance, for they enjoyed their enormous hidden power. We go on to our next screen and we read, the priest in Babylon could not offer sacrifice, so the Levites were almost their equals because there was no Jerusalem and no temple. But in 540, the priests did assert their rights when Cyrus the Great freed Judah to return to Jerusalem and sacrifice could begin again. The Levites' comfort with exile and alienation helped Judeans remember that Moses and all the patriarchs were aliens, for their God was universal and did not need a temple or a land. Judeans were called to develop an individual spirituality as reflected in the Shema prayer. We go on to our next screen and we read, the priests did insist that the Jerusalem temple was an important sign of oneness, to keep scattered Judeans united as one. The Levites agreed, for they believed that the temple of oneness could be more a spiritual sign of oneness and of the eternal Jerusalem. So some Levites saw Jesus when he came as a fellow alien from his temple in the eternal Jerusalem. This attitude enriched the church and the gospel. We go on to our next screen and we read, the D&P editors were both sons of Levi. The priest faded with the temple's ruins in 70. But some Levites inspired the apostles to believe it was God's will to spread the gospel as universal aliens. I thank you so much for joining us for our second overview.